Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Shindell Seal. I was actually born in Barbados, but I've lived in Los Angeles for many, many years. By way of introduction, I am related to Shirley Chisholm as a second cousin. And I wanted to set the stage for you about who she is and why she's so significant to Barbados and the world at large. So, initially, I'd like to kind of set the stage. Shirley was born in Brooklyn in 1924. Her father was Charles St. Hill, who was from what they called at that time British Guyana. Her mom, Ruby Seal, was from Christchurch. Ruby was my grandfather's sister. That's how we're related. So Shirley's born in 1924 in New York. And if you know anything about New York during that time, it was a bustling, dynamic place filled with nearly 6 million people. And new immigrants were arriving every day. Shirley's parents, Charles and Ruby, were very, very much in the mix of all of this, with her dad working as a laborer and at a bakery, and her mom working as a seamstress and a domestic worker. So between them, there are 4 jobs. Then came Shirley and her sisters. And as any of us can imagine, it was a bit overwhelming for Ruby, trying to manage the demands of her 2 jobs, her husband and his 2 jobs, and her young children, all the while navigating this ever changing landscape. So when Shirley was 5, Ruby sent Shirley and her 2 sisters to her grandmother, my great grandmother, Emmeline Seal, in Barbados, Foxhall to be exact, where she had a farm. Now, this was a formidable age for Shirley, and this experience is what propelled her throughout her life. Uh, you know, Throughout her life, Shirley often referred to the strength, the dignity, and the love that her grandmother taught her. And this in itself is an important historical element because when we consider what America was like for Black people at that time, these sentiments are really, really profound. Um, for a bit of context, this was the time of the Harlem Renaissance. Blacks were flocking to areas like New York and northern states, searching for stable jobs and better living conditions than what they had in the South, where they experienced tremendous racism and disenfranchisement. There was always this push within the Black community in the United States back then to fight for their dignity, to believe in themselves, even though they were Black. But Shirley didn't need the slogans or the Black movements to tell her that because her grandmother already had. It's really, really a powerful story. So that's a little bit of background, setting the stage as to really how her formidable initial years were set. Now, as far as her education, having myself gone to school in Barbados until I was 9, just like Shirley, I always found it curious that she loved the strictness of her school. All of the things I loved about school, strict, would never have come into my lexicon. But Shirley absolutely loved the rigor, the regiment, and the demand for excellence from her schooling in Barbados. She attributed all of her positive educational characteristics to having received this type of education so early in life. So when she returned to New York, she excelled at school. She attended Girls High School in Bed-Stuy. That's the neighborhood she lived in New York. And because of her excellence, she ended up becoming the vice president of the Honor Society at her school. And this continual demonstration of excellence caused her to be accepted to 3 highly reputable colleges. She chose Brooklyn College, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts in 1946. For a bit of context on this, at that time, there were only 1% of Blacks in the United States who had completed a 4-year degree. 1%. In fact, many colleges and universities wouldn't even accept Black people at the time. But she had 3 of them vying for her. And at Brooklyn College, she was a member of a sorority and the Harriet Tubman Society, and eventually graduated cum laude. She also earned her master's degree in childhood education a few years afterwards from Columbia University. Now, as you can imagine, she was very active in civil rights and political action campaigns during her time in college. I mean, with a Bajan mom and a father who spent a significant amount of time in Barbados, you know she would have to be influenced by politics. Her father was an avid supporter of Marcus Garvey, who was deep into the Back to Africa movement because of the mistreatment of Blacks in the United States. But Shirley herself was strongly influenced by the Barbados workers and anti-colonial independence movements that was happening at that time. All of this compounded with her already strong sense of self really created this really deep and profound strength during her time in Barbados to continue this chain of unlikely but inevitable events. And I'm going to get to that a little bit later as we discuss really her impact. But I wanted to touch a little bit on her family life. Just a brief kind of discussion about her marriages and her faith, because those were very strong foundational pieces for her as well. So around the time that she graduated from college, she met Conrad Chisholm, an immigrant who was from Jamaica. He became a private investigator who was specializing in like negligence-based lawsuits, which were huge at the time. This was during a time in the United States where there were a lot of politics surrounding workers' rights and the negligence of industry. So they ended up getting married in 1949, but they never had any children. They ended up divorcing in 1977, and she remarried this gentleman named Arthur Hardwick Jr., who was a former New York State Assemblyman. As far as her faith is concerned, she was a devout Christian and belonged to the Quaker Brethren, but eventually began attending services in a Methodist church in her area until her death. So this was just kind of just a brief synopsis about her family and her faith and kind of the foundational pieces in her life. As far as her career is concerned, it goes without saying that Shirley was committed, and that's in all caps, to education. And that's where her career took her. After she graduated with her bachelor's degree, she became a teacher's aide and did that for 7 years while working on her master's degree. She then became the director of a nursery, then a childcare center. Her early education and child welfare expertise grew, and because of it, she actually became an educational consultant for New York's Bureau of Child Welfare. And that was no easy accomplishment considering the cultural climate she worked in. But as with everything else, she excelled. She became involved in local Democratic politics around 1953 or so. And this was in a push to get candidates for local governments to support civil rights, to fight housing discrimination, and to improve economic opportunities for the people in Brooklyn. And I want to contextualize that a bit as well, because Black women were rarely, if ever, seen leading anything during this time. Even decision-making positions were closed to women, and more specifically, Black women. Now, Shirley made it clear that she was not about that life at all. She was about fighting oppression wherever she encountered it. So she lent her skills to lots of political campaigns that promoted equal rights for women and minorities. So much so, honestly, that in 1964, she actually was elected to the New York State Assembly. Then 4 years after that, she was elected to Congress, where she led this expansion of food and nutrition programs for the poor, and she rose to party leadership. In fact, she had several successes in the legislature. She got unemployment benefits extended to domestic workers, which was unheard of. She sponsored the introduction of a program called SEEK, which is the Search for Education, Elevation, and Knowledge. She got it introduced to the state, which it provided disadvantaged students with the chance to enter college while receiving intensive remedial education. And at this point, this wasn't something that was ever open to poor minorities anywhere in the nation. So she was very progressive, very much ahead of her time. So much so that in 1968, when she became the first Black woman to be elected to the United States Congress, she was actually the only woman in the first year class for that year. So she's surrounded by all of these men. She declared her candidacy in January of 1968. Martin Luther King was assassinated in May of 1968. Just 4 months after she decided she was going to jump into politics. Now, she'd seen Malcolm X assassinated just 3 years earlier, just a stone's throw away from the district she was attempting to represent. During the 60s, there were dozens of civil rights activists that were killed just for standing up for the rights of Black people. But Shirley was undeterred. In fact, I think those events motivated her even more to change things for the better. And because of this, she represented her district for 7 terms, from 1969 to 1983. But But not only was she the first African American woman in Congress, she also holds the distinction of becoming the first Black candidate for any major party nomination for President of the United States. President of the United States, and the first woman to run for the Democratic Party's nomination. When I tell you that this was no easy feat, I cannot stress that enough. She was in Congress during the Nixon administration. This is an administration that was committed to rolling back all of the gains Blacks and other minorities got by way of the Civil Rights Act that was signed in 1964. So in 1972, she announced her candidacy for president of the United States. And with many, as with many Black campaigns in the United States, hers was underfunded. There was little support for from her Black constituents, and we know whites weren't going to support her. She also was receiving a significant amount of death threats, as of course we would imagine she would. Additionally, Secret Service was not providing her with any type of protection. So her husband at the time took that on himself. But I think what was the most disheartening for her was the lack of support and quasi-sabotaging that she encountered from her Black male counterparts. Because even though she knew her prospect of winning the presidency was hopeless, she still refused to accept the status quo. And throughout her time in Congress, she served, under 3 presidents, 2 of whom were overtly against many of the things she stood for, like equality and progress for all. She still stood her ground, maintaining that dignity and that strength she learned from her grandmother so many years earlier. In 1983, she retired from Congress during the Reagan administration. And then she went on to teach at Mount Holyoke College while continuing her political organizing. I think about the significance of her life, what she stood for, what it is that is meaningful. And there are a lot of terms that come to mind when I think about her. There's strength, of course. There's tenacity. She was determined to accomplish whatever she set out to do. And in most cases, she did. There's agency, just her deliberate navigation of her spaces, making them her own. She belonged to no one and made decisions that served her and her constituents. It's such an inspiration. I think she had deep and profound values and principles and morals. She said what she meant, and she meant what she said. There was no kowtowing. And when we think about what the significance of that is, it forces us to reflect on what being, each of those things would mean in our own spaces. Few of us would have the experiences she did. Few of us would have to make the decisions or the choices she did. We're all unique in that respect, but when you think about your life and the situations in which you find yourselves, how do you demonstrate your strength, whether of mind or will or what have you? How about your tenacity? How far are you willing to go to accomplish that dream you've been talking about? I think about these things when I think about Shirley. Am I willing to sacrifice a few things to get there? What about my agency? What about, being beholden to every whim and everyone? Or are we our own person, making the decisions that serve us? This is what I find to be so significant about what she stood for. I can look to her demonstration of these things and say, if she can do it, I can sure try. And I also think about the importance of educating Barbadians about Shirley Chisholm. Gladly, few Bajans can appreciate the tumultuous era that Shirley Chisholm cut her teeth in. I dare say that most Americans have no idea the deep hostilities that Black people, Black women especially, faced during her time and actually still face today. But for Bajans to get a glimpse of what one of our kin, a woman whose legacy began here, did and was able to accomplish in a country that did everything it could to suppress her and people who looked like her, it should be empowering. Here you have this Bajan-bred woman, 8 years after Blacks were allowed the freedoms of whites, for her to declare to the nation that she was daring to run for the president of the United States. To know that should inspire and motivate you beyond measure, because it was our values, our Bajan dignity embedded in her that created this chain of events and caused us to be here now talking about how amazing she was. And for my family, When I think about the significance of this, the naming of her primary school, Vauxhall, in her memory, I can say that we're proud, we're moved. For all of us that have been schooled in Barbados, never in a million years, never, ever in a million years would we think that we would be anything more than what we see, what we saw, the police officers, the bank tellers, the teachers, what have you. We went to school, we did our work in hopes of doing well on our exams so we could get good jobs and support ourselves. This is all of us, not just our family. But Shirley's drive, her vision, and her profound compassion for humanity, the less fortunate, the lower income, the marginalized, all of it, it compelled her, in some cases, to put her life on the line. She risked a lot to help those who could never repay her, who would never be able to repay her. It's really such an honor to be related to her, and I can't put that emotion into words. So from that to think about what Barbados could do in her memory, and this is by no means a partisan political statement, but I look at the Prime Minister Motley. She's put forth a lot of the elements of the platform that Shirley stood on, even internationally. And I sit here in Los Angeles, and I've seen it. Her advocacy is in many ways carrying Shirley Chisholm's legacy to higher heights. In Barbados, I believe we should teach Shirley's life in schools as a local hero with a global impact. And honestly, it's not just about her memory, it's about educating students and all of us, frankly, about our civic duty and about our duty to one another, and creating opportunities for us to demonstrate that every day. I think that would be a phenomenal way to honor the legacy of Shirley Chisholm. So I'm really looking forward to joining my family and other close relatives of Shirley Chisholm on April 4th as we honor her legacy by renaming the school, the Vauxhall School, in her name. This will be the culmination, honestly, of all of the hard work that she's done within the United States, and that's had broad reach across the world. This is a great time. Thank you.